At Charlotte, we believe nothing is more powerful than what's next. Welcome to the university where potential turns into action, opportunity turns into success, innovation turns into transformation, and leaders drive progress in Charlotte and beyond. Here, barriers are made to be broken, and community is the foundation for greatness. At Charlotte, your chance to create the future begins. What happens after that is up to you. Charlotte, shape what's next.
So good afternoon. I am Jennifer Troyer. I am Dean of the Belk College of Business at UNC Charlotte, and welcome to the North Carolina Economic Forecast. Over the years, we've been thankful to our friends from the business community for providing essential funding for this event, and for the research that underlies the presentation. So we are seeking sponsors to help keep this quarterly event complimentary for alumni, the business community, and our students. For sponsorship information, you can email us at belkrsvp@charlotte.edu. If you have questions, please submit them via chat at any time. We will have a question and answer session following today's presentation. So for those of you on Twitter, you can join today's conversation by using #NCForecast. We look forward to seeing your tweets. And now it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague and our speaker, Dr. John Connaughton, Professor of Financial Economics in the Belk College. John joined the Belk College in 1978 and became Director of the Economic Forecast in 1981, with the first quarterly presentation in 1982, 40 years ago. So for 40 years, John has been interpreting the data and sharing his expertise on where North Carolina's economy has been and where it's going. Welcome, Dr. John Connaughton.
Thank you, Jennifer. And let me get my screen up here. We have a lot to do today, so I'm going to just get right into it. As you probably know, there are a lot of things going on in the economy right now, and we need to kind of move through things today. So here's the outline for today. Take a brief look at where the virus is right now, 2 years on from when we first started talking about this. Take a look at state recoveries and how North Carolina has done relative to other states. Real quick look at energy prices because they are really driving inflation right now in a lot of ways. We're going to take a look at 2021 and 2022, and we're also going to take a first look at 2023. Then we're going to talk about inflation, which has been on everybody's tongue for the last 6 to 9 months. And then we're going to look at the prospects for recession going forward, and what that's likely to, if that's likely to happen, and what it's likely to look like. Okay, so starting off with the virus 2 years on, in December 1st of 2019, we had our first hospital case, December 8th. Today, we have over 500 million worldwide cases, 6.3 million worldwide deaths, 84 million US cases. That's about a quarter of our population that are documented, and a little over 1 million US deaths to date. Now, you're going to notice a little difference in the slide here. I just picked these slides from our May 27, 2020 presentation, just to give you a sense of where we're at. 84 million cases today. We had 1.6 million cases 2 years ago. 93,000 deaths, 20,000 plus or minus new cases a day, and 800 deaths. In North Carolina, 2 years ago, we had 24,000 cases total, 766 deaths by the end of May, and 400 new cases per day. We talked about what we could expect going forward. And, we had some demand side impacts that we thought were going to be problematic as a result of the shutdown. We knew it was going to affect consumer confidence, which it did. We were talking about mandatory quarantines and the effects that it would have rolling through the economy. And we talked about industries at risk. We also talked 2 years ago about supply chain shortages and the problems we're going to have with plant shutdowns, and the China experience and the way they were dealing with it, which has come back to haunt us in the last couple of weeks, last month or so, where they've actually started to do their mandatory shutdowns of communities when they shut down everything in that community, and that's the way they're responding. That's a national policy responding to COVID. And we talked about the March and April shutdowns, which is right through here, and how that flattened the curve. Okay, and that was really what we were doing, was trying to flatten that curve where we're getting down to just a few additional cases per day so that the hospitals could handle what was taking place. Well, right now what we've got is kind of the what's going on right now today, and what we're looking at here is U.S. cases over the past year or change, back all the way back to the beginnings of 2020, January 23rd, 2020. And you can see we've had our spikes here. That's that fall spike before the vaccine was available, the little summer Delta spike, and then the big Omicron spike that occurred over the winter holidays. And we see the big drop, and now we're starting to see an uptick again. And that's something we need to think about going forward to, where we're looking at about 100,000 cases a day in the US. For the North Carolina, we're still on the downtrend after the Omicron hit, as you can see. And, you know, it's again, it's a little too early to tell what's going on, but we're not at the forefront of this uptick in cases that we've seen recently. And then the I'm sorry, this is the US COVID deaths, and they're still going down. North Carolina, we had a little uptick, then a drop, and then a little uptick. This drop right here recently is much more of a reflection, if you will, of what's taking place in the data collection. The truth of the matter is we're really starting to become very, very slack at looking at COVID cases, collecting data on COVID cases, doing research on COVID. It's kind of dropped off the front burner, and other things are moving to the forefront. And so the data going forward at this point in time is becoming a little bit sketchy and a little bit concerning in terms of trying to make sense out of it. All right, so let's take a look at some state recoveries over the past 2 years. All right, so here we go. These are the states that have still really struggled to recover as a result of COVID. And as you can see, the United States, we go back to the fourth quarter of 2019, and that's the last really good quarter. The recession began in February of 2020. It was a 2-month recession. We were out of it by the second quarter of 2020. But what we're looking at here is essentially a 2-year window. Over that 2 years, the US GDP, as you know, went down by 30-some-odd% in the second quarter of 2020, back up by 30-some-odd% in the third quarter of 2020. Overall, before this began till the fourth quarter of 2021, that 2 years, US GDP is now 3.1% higher. And as you can see here, we have got essentially 9 states where the GDP is lower than it was before this all began that are having trouble recovering. Wyoming, Alaska are energy producing states. Hawaii and Louisiana's energy, North Dakota's energy. Hawaii is tourism. And these others are kind of a mixed bag. But we also have a lot of other states that, while they have a higher level of GDP in the fourth quarter of 2021 than 2019, they're still very, very slow in terms of recovering. We compare this to the states that have done real well: New Hampshire, Utah, Washington State, California. These are all up considerably compared to the US. North Carolina turns out to be number 9, 4.9% higher GDP today than 2 years ago. We've recovered very, very well, even better than our neighbor South Carolina. So we've had a pretty strong recovery. You know, if you think about it, that's the 4.9% is an average of right at 2.4% per year, which is the average growth rate that we were having before this COVID experience began. So while we had a rocky 2020, at the end of the 2-year period, we're probably no worse off than we would have been had this not occurred, other obviously than the terrible deaths that have taken place and hospitalizations. All right, in terms of states with the lowest unemployment rates, the U.S. Average unemployment rate, U.S. unemployment rate in March was 3.6%. And these are all states that had incredibly low unemployment rates. I mean, you're looking at Nebraska, Utah, Indiana, Montana. You know, these are all, you've got essentially 14 states that have below 3% unemployment rates. And that's pretty low. And North Carolina in March, we've dropped down to 3.5%. We've finally gotten down a little bit below where the U.S. is. But we come in 25th, despite the fact that by any definition, we have full employment in this state. States that have not recovered so as well, similar list, District of Columbia leads with still having a high 6% rate. And we've got basically 16 states that have over a 4% rate of unemployment. Although, again, you look at these group of states here, New York, Delaware, Michigan, Texas, they're all close to where you would consider to be full employment, but there are still a few states that have yet to essentially recover from what took place over the past 2 years. Consumer confidence, unfortunately, as we see during this year, these 2 years have been dropping, and we're now down to a low of 107. Now, this compares to July of 2020 when things were the worst, where we were in here in the 80s, an index number of 80. So we're still in better shape. But over the last 6 to 9 months, we've seen consumer confidence start to fall for a variety of reasons. All right. Real quick, we're going to take a look at energy prices. We're not going to spend a lot of time. The last forecast that we did in March, we spent a lot of time going through exactly how to think about energy. We're just going to talk about prices today. Back in January of 2021, regular gas nationwide was an average of $2.42. We're now at $4.36. I realize those are different from the what you get from AAA, but this is the Energy Institute, U.S. government. And so these are, I think, a little bit more reliable numbers. And this is for the first 3 weeks of May on average, not the current daily rate today for gasoline, but the average for the first 3 weeks of May. Nevertheless, we've seen an 80% increase in the price of gasoline during this, what is essentially less than 18 months. Diesel fuel's been even worse. It's been almost 108% increase during this period of time, and that's very disconcerting. And so diesel fuel has gone up even more, primarily because of demand for diesel fuel vis-a-vis gasoline, as we're starting to ship products to meet consumer demand, as we have some easing up in the supply chain problems that we've had for the last 18 months. This is just to kind of give you a sense as to the nominal price here over the last 92 years. You can see back in the good old days, as they say, when gasoline was 30 cents a gallon, nominal price, and we can see the nominal price rising over time. But if you adjust that for inflation and express it as the real 2021 prices, or in 2021 prices, what you see is a much more stable, around $3, actually $2.93 on average. And to be clear, I mean, today the price we have is not a whole lot different from what we had back in the 30s in terms of the real price of gasoline. But here's the kicker, all right? And this is the one that I think we really need to pay attention to. So I did this table and I presented it to you last March, and it was the idea of, okay, every time gas goes up by 50 cents, what does that mean to consumers? All right. And so what it basically means is that just in terms of gasoline, it takes $61 billion out of consumer pockets. But when you take into account everything, which is all the shipping that takes place, all the manufacturing that takes place, heating and electricity and all those other things that petroleum goes into, it's really a total of $150 billion every time gas goes up by 50 cents. We've seen gas go up by $1.94. That's almost fourfold, 4.50 increases, which means that on annually, this spike in gasoline prices from $2.50 to $4.30 has basically taken almost $600 billion out of consumer pockets. They got to spend it on gasoline. They don't spend it on other things. And that's really where the problem in terms of rapidly increasing gasoline prices, where the problem really resides, and where we really need to be cautious and understand the impact it's having on the overall economy. All right, so I showed you this last time. I show it to you again because most folks don't remember this in 1974. And I added one thing to it. I said 1974 gas lines when we had serious shortages. And I added this little parentheses because what we tend to fail to remember is that part of the reason was an Arab oil embargo because of Europe and the US's support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War the previous year. But the real issue here is that at that time we had price controls on energy and we weren't allowing price to ration gasoline. We were simply doing it by getting online, keeping prices low so the consumers were happy. But even when prices are low, you can't get the product, you're not all that happy. So this is just kind of a reminder of the kinds of things we get into when we try to fool Mother Nature, or to economists, we try to fool markets. And of course, just another reminder, those gas lines led to 19 years of 55-mile-an-hour national speed limits. I'm not sure we all want to go back to that. All right, so what happened last year in the economy? We had a stellar year, growth at 6.9%. Little rocky, you see the Delta variant kind of kicked in and gave us a little bit of problem in the third quarter. But on average, the year was a very, very solid, strong year. On a sector by sector basis, we had a number of sectors that had big increases in their GDP, durable goods manufacturing. And for those of you that are looking at this chart for the first time, let me explain to you what the information it provides. The horizontal axis, okay, gives us the growth rate of real GDP within that sector. And the vertical axis right here, essentially is a pie chart, gives us the percent of GDP that sector accounts for. What's nice about these is you can look at the size of the rectangle to see how important that sector was contributing to the overall GDP growth of 6.9%. And as you can see, durables really was a big impact on overall GDP growth, as was finance, insurance, and real estate. While it didn't grow a lot, it does make up 18.7%, almost 20% of the state's GDP, and also business and professional services, at 12.9%. Okay, so those are the ones that were growing. We also saw hospitality and leisure services grow by 23.6%. That's your combinations and your food service industries that are in there. Excuse me. But as you can see, it only makes up 3.1% of GDP. So even though it was a big growth, it didn't have a big impact on the overall 6.9% GDP growth. On a job standpoint, we had a 3.6% growth rate in jobs. Compare that to the normal, right around 2%. So it was really a big job year. Again, hospitality and leisure services, big job growth, 11.7%. Well, it only makes up less than 3% of GDP, or right around 3% of GDP. It makes up 10% of employment. So that was a big boost to the jobs. Overall, 163,200 net jobs were created from December of 2020 to December of 21. And what we're looking at there is considerably above the 90 to 100,000 jobs we get and job increase we get in a normal year. For 2022, and I got to be real careful here. All right, so the first quarter was down, and we saw that in the US. We see that also in North Carolina. I need to make it very clear that the first quarter decline in GDP, both nationally and the state, really had a lot more to do with some one-time events. But for those, it would have been pretty much flat, not necessarily negative. And what we looked at was some significant inventory adjustments, probably brought about by some serious supply chain issues during the first quarter of this year. But nevertheless, changes in inventories contributed considerably to the overall decline. What's really interesting about this was that nominal GDP for the US was up over 5%. All right. But because of inflation, real GDP was down by over 1%. And so we started to see a big eat, if you will, that inflation creates in terms of GDP. We spent 5% more on goods and services in the first quarter, but we didn't make as many goods and services in the first quarter as we did in the fourth quarter of 2021. because of inflation. And what we're seeing here are modest numbers for the remainder of the year. We're going to talk a little bit about this later on. As you can see, we're not at this point suggesting a recession. There's some wait and see on that, and we'll talk about that. We'll save a lot of time to talk about that at the end of the presentation. But right now, this is our, I wouldn't call it optimistic, I'd call it the most likely outcome during this year as we see the economy slow, as we start to see Fed monetary policy tightening. But the real wild card is and what the Fed, how aggressive the Fed's going to be over the next several months. We expect jobs. If you we expect, excuse me, we look here at the growth rate in the individual sectors. We see that manufacturing is down considerably from where it was a year ago. Only information and hospitality and leisure services and business and professional services are showing some significant growth. Most of the rest of the sectors, not so much. I think the important thing to look at here, two interesting areas. One is retail and wholesale trade, which we expect to be down this year. And that's should not be a surprise to anyone, but also construction we expect to be lower this year or decline slightly this year. We're already starting to see, and this is principally a result of what's going on with mortgage interest rates and the impact it's going to have on residential construction going forward during 2022. As far as jobs are concerned, we've already created a number of jobs in the state in the first 3 months. We expect jobs to basically come through pretty solid 110,000 jobs, net jobs during the year for growth of about 2.4%. But this should pretty much end the job growth that we've experienced in the past. All right, unemployment rate, as I say, right now it's 3.6%. We expect it to drop to 3.4% by the end of this year, 2022. Again, this is all predicated on not having a recession. So I want to make sure everybody is on board with that and we completely understand that issue, okay? All right, so far through the recovery, we've talked about this before. GDP is 4.9% higher. We have 53,000 more jobs. And as of December 2021, the unemployment rate was 0.3% higher. Right now, the March rate is back down to 3.6%. So it's pretty much, the difference in unemployment is pretty much gone away. But this was sort of the 2-year markers. That's 2.4% on average GDP growth in the state per year. We actually have more jobs today than we did in 2019. And the unemployment rate is pretty much where it was when this all began. And so from that perspective, it's pretty easy to suggest by the end of 2021, the whole COVID experience was pretty much over. And we're going forward and we're going to see what's happening. We've got bigger issues to deal with going forward. So for 2023, assuming no recession in 22, you notice the annual growth rate is back to that less than 2% that we were talking about back in 2016, 2017, 2018. It really has to do with the ability of the economy to grow as labor force is stagnant or in fact shrinking. That process started about 5 years ago of labor force stagnation, and it's continuing on and probably gotten a little bit worse during the COVID experience. So without a further growth rate, in the labor force, it's going to be hard to do much better than a 1.9% growth rate on average for GDP during the year. So for 2022 and 2023, what do we know? We know that we're going to have continuing supply chain issues. Anybody tells you that the supply chain is going to miraculously clear up in August or September, it's not going away. There are some major changes in supply chains that are going to take years to address. Whether you're talking chips, whether you're talking precious metals that go into these new electric cars, whether you're talking the relationship we have with China, whether you talk about the Ukrainian war and the impact that it's having, particularly on a number of US and European automakers in terms of components that go into their cars that were made in Ukraine. This supply chain issue is not going away. All right. Second thing we know, inflation. And we got a disturbing chart later in the presentation when we talk about the probability of inflation generating a recession. And then finally, we know we're going to continue to deficit spend despite a number of things that suggest that we shouldn't. Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. Then there are a bunch of unknowns, okay? We are now talking about a variant of Omicron, and Johns Hopkins is suggesting that we may see a new variant spike in the fall, late summer, early fall, like Delta was last year with breakthrough cases. We have no idea what's going to happen in Ukraine. And the big fear there, obviously, is not so much is Ukraine going to win versus is Russia going to be able to maintain what they've taken. The real problem comes when Ukraine starts to take back territory that Russians have held for the last 8 years. And that may likely happen. Then finally, the two things that are most troubling, and that is what we call Fed tapering, which is reducing their basically $9 trillion balance sheet of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities that they hold, and Fed interest rate policy going forward. And we're going to speak a lot about that when we talk about the possibility of inflation, recession at the end of this presentation. So let's talk a little bit about inflation and where we are right now. Types of inflation, we've gone through this before, but just remind everybody, demand pull, and that's when demand for output exceeds what the economy can produce and buyers bid up prices. We've had stimulus checks, government spending, $5.5 trillion of government spending over the last 18 months. All of those stimulus checks going out, average, family of 2 adults and 1 child getting almost $9,000 in after-tax stimulus checks. All of that led to demand pull inflation in 2020 and 2021. Now we have cost push, and that's where prices are pushed up by increases in costs and availability of factors of production. This is the supply chain problem. We also have work disincentives. We have early retirements by the baby boomers, a number of things that are capping, if you will, the labor force in this country, and creating essentially problems going forward in terms of being able to produce a labor force big enough to keep prices from being pushed up by cost of operation. All right, so in the 70s, the inflation pressure was coming from new domestic programs, the war on poverty, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. We passed these programs, Medicare, Medicaid, AFDC, food stamps, and 12 more anti-poverty programs. We had the Vietnam War, and then something that everybody tends to forget, but I'll suggest that you pop on the YouTube and take a look at the video for the Nixon shock. It'll only take you 10 minutes to watch it. But in that video in August of 71, he announced a wage and price freeze, and then followed by some controls. He instituted a 10% import tariff, and he effectively took the United States off the gold standard in 1971. And these were all things that basically took a decade to work through. On the cost push side, we had energy prices. We had the 73, 74 gas shortage and the 79 gas shortage. These were all detrimental to the economy, drove prices up on the cost side and the availability side of energy to produce, and it drove prices up basically because it drove costs up. This is the decade of the 70s, and you can see the price increases. And this is when Nixon announced price controls, but you can see the effect of price controls going off the gold standard, and basically a 10% import tariff on all products imported into this country, and the effect that it had on inflation in 74 double digits, 75 almost double digits, 79 double digits, and even in 1980 double digits. One of the things that was driving a lot of this inflation back here was, a completely opposite thing that we're experiencing today, and that was labor force participation or labor force growth rates that were pushing 3% in the early 70s. Now, normally these things are, as you can see now, it's flat, negative during COVID, but even here, where the labor force is growing by less than 0.5% a year, and during the last decade, it's been at, right at or slightly below a 1% growth rate. And back here, you have 3% growth rate, and that was really causing problems in the economy. That's primarily because baby boomers were of the age that they were starting to enter the labor force. And at the same time, we had a structural change as we had dramatic increases in female labor force participation rates in the 70s. All of those things led to really high increases in labor force growth rates during that period of time. All right, today's inflation pressures, we have demand pull. We've already documented a number of this over time, over the past 6 months. Domestic spending increases, $5.5 trillion, stimulus checks, enhanced unemployment payments, the payroll protection plan, the child care credit that existed during most of 21, and the SNAP benefit upgrade, which is a little bit more complex, but basically what they did was they changed the calorie count administratively. And by upping the calorie count, the checks have to also increase in order for recipients to be able to afford that level of calories. On the cost push side, we've had declining labor force participation rates, particularly amongst baby boomers. We've had shifting demographics. The baby boomers came into labor force in the 70s and created problems. Now they're leaving the labor force in the 20s and again creating some problems. We've talked about the extended supply chains and the problems that, a shutting of a supply here, or shutting down an economy in small parts of China and other countries in the world create problems because of an overemphasis on specialization and where components come from. That has produced real supply chain issues for most of 21, all of 22 as well, and well into 23, maybe 24 as well. Expanded regulations, we've had COVID issues, and of course we've had oil prices. As economies worldwide are recovering, drives up oil prices. All right, so here's basically the monthly increases over the last year and a half, starting back in January and February of 2021. And you can see that beginning in April of 2021, excuse me, this is 20, and yeah, this is 20, this is 21, this is 22. So beginning in April of 2021, we started to see the first, really kind of a hit on prices, and it's been going up and escalating. March was 8.54%, and April was 8.26%. All right, these are annual numbers, just annual numbers. So this number is 8.26%. Prices in April of 2022 were 8.26% higher than they were in April of 2021. All right. In terms of some of the causes that were leading to this, food was up 9% in April compared to April of 21. That makes up 13.4% of all the items in the basket that they shop. Energy was up 30%, which makes up 7.4%. Gasoline, 43%, which is a part of energy. New vehicles, 13%. Used vehicles, almost 23%. Okay, so you can start to see where the culprits are in terms of what's driving the overall rate of 8.3. All right, so this is the part you've been waiting for, I hope anyway. We've got a few minutes to go through this. Recession with a question mark. What's going to happen in the next few months? We've already seen a first quarter decline in real GDP. Are we in a recession and we don't know it yet? Or is a recession coming sometime during 2022? All right, just kind of a primer, 5 decades of recessions going back to November of 73. And we've had essentially since in the last 5 decades, we've essentially had 7 recessions. All right. And we document those recessions. We document the duration of the recessions. All right. We had 3 long ones. The 74, 75 was 16 months. The 81, 82 was 16. And the Great Recession was 18 months. COVID was only 2 months. But the minor recessions which were not caused by shocks, were much, much shorter in duration. And this is the length of the expansion from the previous trough to the peak. So before the 2001 recession, during the 90s, we had 120 months or 10 years of uninterrupted economic growth. And after the Great Recession, before the COVID recession, we had 128. These 1, 2, 3, 4 of the longest uninterrupted expansions have been the last 4 expansions. So I think that's very encouraging going forward. It doesn't mean you're not going to have another recession. However, when we get through this, it's very likely we can have a fairly long period of economic expansion. So these recession causes, let's take a look at what happened. I call it the 74-75, even though it technically began at the very end of 73. That was the era of oil embargo and those gas lines we saw, and the impact that it had on the economy. The 80 recession was the Iranian Revolution and the Fed policy, because remember in October of 79, Paul Volcker started raising interest rates very, very rapidly, created a small recession in the 80s and a bigger one in 81, 82. Fed policy completely. They created that recession in order to get rid of, if you remember, 10 years of really runaway inflation. The 90-91 recession was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and to a certain extent, Fed policy, and I don't have it down here, but a little fiscal policy as a result of George H.W. Bush raising taxes. The 2001 recession, dot-com bubble, which occurred at the end of the 90s, and again, Fed policy. The Great Recession, gas prices, and the housing bubble. I know you say, well, gas prices, it was the housing bubble. No, it actually started in the summer of 2007, when we first hit $4 gasoline prices, kind of slowed the economy. And that kicked off the housing bubble problem, which was the second big shoe that dropped, that created all kinds of problems in 2008 and 2009, March of 2008, when Bear Stearns was about to fail, and again in September of 2008 when Lehman failed. And then finally, the most recent one, which was a COVID recession. All right, so recession uncertainty. Well, we cannot get away from this. We have continuing and expanding supply chain issues. We hope that it gets better, but we can see it's not getting better. Okay, in fact, some suggest that it's getting worse, particularly as China and some other countries are shutting down because of new strains of COVID, creating problems where they're having mandatory quarantining and mandatory shutting of factories for weeks, if not months at a time. We have the ongoing problem of inflation. Yeah, we're spending more and more and more in nominal terms, but in real terms, we can't buy as much with that inflated money. We're very uncertain about Fed interest rate policy. We'll talk about why we're uncertain with it and with Fed tapering, i.e. reducing the size of their balance sheet and selling off some government bonds and some mortgage-backed securities. We still have Congress engaged in deficit spending, and we have an unknown, as we mentioned earlier, about the variant of Omicron potentially creating some issues, and maybe the vaccines may be somewhat less effective against this new Omicron variant. And then the wild card, as always, is Ukraine. These are all things that are drags on the economy. Take a look at inflation. So the blue is what's been going on the last couple of years. And you can see we're at 8.3% in April of 2022, okay? Nope. Suppose we are able, starting this month, to reduce the annual rate of inflation to 4%. In other words, we get a handle on it right now. I don't think that's likely, but I'm just suggesting we cut it in half. Miraculously, we can cut it in half. We're still going to see 7% and 6% annualized increases going forward because of what has already taken place in the first few months of this year. All right, these are not going away. So even if we cut inflation to 4% going forward, we're still going to be looking at over 6% rates by the end of 2022. And that is very, very problematic, obviously, because inflation has an impact. And as long as this number, because this is the headline number, as long as this number is in the 6 to 7% range, the Fed is going to have to be much more hawkish in regards to their interest rate policy and their tapering. Now, here's a chart, real quick. The CPI is the annual, and we're going all the way back to 60 here, the annual percent change in the consumer price index by monthly compared to the previous year's same month. All right. And then the red line is the federal funds rate. And if you watch this thing and you look at it, we're pretty much generating. Now, again, look at the gray, because the gray those are the periods of recession. And we expect Fed to drop rates rapidly to counteract recession. Okay. But what I want you to pay attention to is that for most of the time, okay, the federal funds rate has been close to or above the consumer price index or inflation, which generates positive, adjusted for inflation, real interest rates. I want you to look here since 2020 and what we're dealing with. And I've got a close-up of that right here. So as a result of the 2-month recession, we have seen consumer price index rise dramatically above the federal funds rate. And so we have essentially negative, and I mean significantly negative, real interest rates, somewhere in the order of 7% or more. And so that's really what's problematic. And it is unlike virtually any other time, particularly any extended period. I mean, here we have prices above the federal funds rate, but that's trying to generate a recovery. All right. But even here, coming out of the 80 recession and coming out of the 2000 recession, coming out of the 90 recession, the federal funds rate is still a little bit above the inflation rate. So this is a real departure from where we usually see the Fed operating. So the Federal Open Market Committee interest rate policy, and I put the word in there, resolve. How hawkish are they going to continue to be? So the current federal funds target after the last month's, earlier this month's 50 basis point rise increase is now between 3/4 and 1%. That's their target rate. The remaining meetings this year are June, July, September, and November. The December federal funds rate target they've already suggested is between 2 and 2.25%. But we expect, best case scenario, the inflation rate, the annual inflation rate, by the end of December to be in the 5 to 6% range, or maybe even above 6%. So we're still talking about a really big gap here. Now, my guess is we'll get another 50 basis points in June, and then 25 basis points in the remaining 3 meetings. That'll put, this 3/4 to 1% to 2 to 2.25%. That's if they remain firm. But if the economy starts dropping quicker than we expect, will the Fed continue that resolve? Now, this is the balance sheet. We can see it here during the Great Recession, up to $4.5 trillion through just normal maturity of the bonds that they held. They reduced it to about 3.7 trillion. And now during COVID, we've seen it increase to essentially 8.9 trillion as of last week. And what they're expecting to do is they're projecting a 45.5 billion cap on adjustments. In other words, they will not sell more than 47.5 billion per month during the months of June, July, and August. And then after that, from September of 22 to December of 23, they're willing to go up to 95 billion in terms of the cap. That's not what they're going to sell, but it won't sell more than 95 billion in held securities, treasuries, and mortgage-backed securities per month between September of 22 and December of 23. And the projected cap, if you will, is a reduction in the Fed balance sheet of about 1.6 trillion by December of 2023. We're still looking at a $7.2 trillion balance sheet. They can't go very quickly here because remember, they bought these bonds in pretty close to a 0 interest rate. And now the interest rates mortgage rates are 5%. Selling a mortgage-backed security you bought for 2.5 to 3%, you're going to have to sell it at a discount. So you're actually going to lose money. That's really kind of what's pushing this cap, is the amount of money that they can afford to lose by selling these bonds at a discount. All right, so this is historic length of recessions. As you can see, as time goes on, the period goes on, we've got much better at getting ourselves out of recessions. My goodness, back in the 18th, excuse me, try that one more time. In the 19th century, recessions and expansions lasted about the same amount of time. So you have 2 years of recession, and then 2 years of expansion, and then 2 years of recession again. So anyway, key takeaways. Exogenous energy shocks matter. Oil prices matter. Fed policy matters, how resolved they are going forward. The wealth effect, the effect that the stock market correction we're having today on consumer demand going forward. These are all issues. Puts it at a 50-50 recession chance in 2022. And I just want to mention that state and regional impacts disparities remain constant over time in terms of recessions. Some places don't get hit, like the Plains and the Rocky Mountains regions. Other parts of the country get hammered. So keys to watch going forward: COVID-19 spike and a new variant, probably not until the fall, late summer, fall. Fed tapering, are they going to buckle up and continue to do what they say they're going to do? Or are they going to get nervous and concerned about the dual mandate? Oil prices, very uncertain. Ukraine, very uncertain. We'll get the May inflation rate in June, June 10th. The next FOMC meeting is June 14th to 15th. On the 15th, at 2 o'clock, we'll find out if they're going to kick it up another 50 basis points. If they do, that's good on the inflation side, but clearly not fast enough to do much about inflation this year. But if they do, it'll also probably mean that we'll slide into recession in the second half of the year. Consumer confidence comes out May 31st. It'll be real interesting, given what's happening in the stock market as we speak, how consumers feel when they start opening up their 401k reports. U.S. monthly job growth will be the first Friday of the month, and that'll be at June 3rd. And second quarter GDP, that'll give us an indication as to whether or not the first quarter was a blip or not. That comes out on July 28th of 2022. So those are things to look forward to. And I want to thank you all, and I'll turn this over to Jennifer, and she can, I guess she'll get pepper me with questions.
Yes, once I figure out how to unmute myself. You think I'd learned already. Okay. So yeah, so thank you, John. Thank you for sharing your knowledge yet again. I'm here for the forecast. We have gotten quite a few questions. Just as a reminder, you can continue to submit your questions. So first question actually came in before you even started talking, John.
Uh-oh.
All right, so let's see. This one was, sorry. Here we go. So this one was really asking if you have any advice for folks who are nearing retirement, or who, are retired. Are there any moves that you would recommend for them, given where we are with the economy?
Well, yeah, I'm not a financial advisor, that's really tough. I would say this, though, to anyone who is contemplating. You're going to start, more and more of us are on 401ks, as opposed to defined benefit plans. If you're on a defined benefit plan, I don't think you need to worry about what's going to happen this year in the economy. But if you're on a 401k, you may be thinking this may not be the best time to retire, because you're going to have to start taking out of that. And you haven't probably seen it yet, but you probably get statements quarterly. Your next statement that you get after the second quarter, probably not going to look real good compared to what it was 6 months ago. And so, I would be very, very cautious for those who are thinking about retiring in the near future, and hoping we can work our way through this. My guess is that this will, if we get a recession this year, it will be short. We'll see the unemployment rate probably kick up to pretty close to 6 or 7%, but we should start to see recovery coming pretty quickly.
Okay. So, speaking of unemployment, a few labor market questions. So one question is really asking about the large number of new business startups that we saw recently. as as people were sort of rethinking what they were doing, what they were doing in life and in work. Have we seen have we seen those businesses be successful? Do you know anything about that?
It's too early. It's too early to tell whether it's successful. I mean, the boom is because all you got to do is look at what's happened in the last year in the economy. Look at those numbers for the quarterly growth rates, with the exception of the third quarter because of the Omicron spike that we had. Try that one more time. The Delta spike at the end of the summer. All the other quarters were off the chart in real terms. And so, all of the businesses you see start up in 2022, in late 23, in 2020, late 21 and early 22 are all based on what people saw during most of 21 when the economy is gangbusters. And they say, hey, now's the time to get in on this. The economy is exploding. It is a little easier to be successful when the wind's at your back than it is when the wind's coming at you. And so, that's what we've seen. What is going to be interesting to see is do we hit a recession? Do we get a soft landing, or do we not get a soft landing? If we don't get a soft landing and we get a recession, how resilient will these new businesses be going forward? Because typically new businesses, at least in the first few years, are the ones that are undercapitalized and the ones that are at most risk if a recession shows up. So it could get ugly.
So, you touched on food and energy costs as contributing to the inflation rate. Can you also talk about the cost of shelter, housing, and rent prices, particularly in North Carolina's housing markets?
Okay, so we've seen dramatic increases in North Carolina, particularly in the urban areas. Raleigh, Greensboro, Charlotte, Wilmington, Asheville, some of the higher growth areas where people want to move to from around the country. And so we've seen prices for real estate, whether it's home owner occupied or apartments, we've seen it rise considerably during 2021 and even into early 2022. I think that's pretty much done. I don't think we're going to see it. The big thing that's going to drive this going forward is mortgage rates. 6 months ago, you could get a mortgage, 30-year fixed mortgage for under 3%. Today, it's pushing 5.5%. That's if you're very well qualified. This has a big impact on ability to pay. So while prices are going to stop and maybe come down a little bit, cost of housing is still going to be quite high because it's a combination of what you pay for the house, but also the mortgage rate that you pay. And mortgage rates are going up, and they're going to continue to go up. So for anybody that's sitting out there looking at, well, should I get out of my rental and get into a house? Sooner the better, because I don't see mortgage rates being anything but higher, even if a recession crops up, anything but higher going forward. The Fed is going to have to remain resolved of raising rates to fight inflation. That one chart I showed you where it was so out of kilter, even if inflation comes down to 4, 5, 6% by the end of the year, we still are going to have negative real interest rates. And the Fed's got to do something about that. They've got to continue to raise rates.
I think that one question we had is sort of a basic economic question about what would have happened if the government had not pumped so much money into the economy, or not enough. Could there have been a recession instead of inflation, and which one is worse?
That's a great question. Okay, and it's a question that nobody has asked me in the last 2 years. Okay, so it's a great question. My sense of this, and I'm going to cut some slack for Congress and the Fed in terms of what happened in April and May of 2020 when we passed the first set of COVID responses. We've had slides before with this, but that was probably about $2.5 trillion that was thrown out there immediately. We didn't know how severe this was going to be. We had no experience as to what the lockdowns were going to do in terms of shutting the economy. And the level of uncertainty was beyond anything that we had ever experienced before. And, I think there was the thinking, both on the part of Congress, the president, and the Federal Reserve. There's only one side of this to err on, and that's to be overly generous. And so I'll cut them complete slack for what they did in April or May of 2020. The problem really starts in the fall of 2020. Because Jennifer, here, we had 30% drop, 33% drop in GDP in the second quarter, the 31% drop, 33% increase in GDP in the third quarter. My mind tells me, okay, it's not over yet, but we certainly got a big rebound. The economy was not systemically affected. And therefore, when we opened the doors again, the banking system was there, transportation, everything was there ready to go. So we're able to recover pretty darn quickly. And so it was the fall of 2020 stimulus package, which is strictly motivated by the election in November. Nobody wanted to vote against that. And then again in February of 21 with another $2 trillion, $1.9 trillion package. Those were totally unnecessary. And those are the ones that kicked inflation off. There's no question about it in my mind. So had we just had the $2.5 trillion initial sets, and maybe in the fall of 2020, a very small $500 billion, highly targeted, because we knew who was still hurt. In the beginning, we didn't know who was going to get hit. We had to just send money out there in a broad sense. But by the end of the summer, we knew who was still hurting, and we could have had a much smaller, more targeted package. And my guess is if we had stopped there, we would not have had the inflation. We had some inflation, but we would not have the inflation levels that we're experiencing right now. And I don't think anybody would be extremely excited if we were looking at a 3.5% to 4% rate of inflation right now as a result of trying to get us out of COVID. But 8%, it's a little scary. 8% when wages are going up by 4.5%, 5%, we all know that's a real tax, and people are worse off.
So, in terms of the sort of non-energy related inflation, many people, you see pundits arguing that that's related to a shift in spending from services to goods related to COVID behaviors. And do you have any forecast about whether those consumer behaviors will be permanently shifted or not?
I don't think so, because I think that we're already starting to see a shift back. If we look at the spending right now that's taking place, it's taking place I think in two areas. One is the hit that people are taking and having to spend a lot of their income just on gasoline, because as I've said before, you live where you live, you work where you work, you drive what you drive. And there, in the short term, there's not a lot of ability to respond to the rising energy prices. So a lot of your income gets shifted over from what you were doing over to putting gas in your car and putting food into your refrigerator and cupboard. What we're also seeing this summer is a big increase in travel, and that obviously qualifies under services. And as a result of that, but people are making up for 2 years of lost time. Yes, cities are going to be crowded. Events in cities are going to be crowded. We're going to see some international travel for the first time, significant international travel for the first time. There aren't going to be a lot of Americans at home this summer, despite what's going on with gasoline prices in the economy.
So we've had a lot of really great questions, and we have time for just one more. So here's the last one. So do you think that the supply chain problems will cause manufacturing to move back to the U.S.?
Yes, I think we're already seeing that. I think we're seeing that in two very visible ways. One, we've already seen significant investment in chip factories. I think that's been a big issue. And going forward, there's going to be an incredible increase in demand for chips as we move from internal combustion engines to more electric vehicles, because they simply have 3 to 4 times as many chips in the vehicle as internal combustion engines do. We've seen that. The second thing we're seeing, which is really kind of interesting, is increase in battery production. which we haven't seen in the past. We've been relying on basically China in Southeast Asia building batteries for our cars and our computers, etc., our phones, and we're starting to see a change in that. The problem that I've got, Jennifer, that really bothers me is while I see manufacturing coming back, we still are, there's a lot of uncertainty as to availability, access to a lot of these minerals that go into making batteries for electric cars. Cobalt, lithium, even aluminum, for crying out loud. We've seen a tremendous in copper. We've seen twofold increases in these commodity prices in the last 6 to 9 months, strictly because of the mines are at capacity, and we mostly import that stuff, and there doesn't seem to be any movement going forward to change that scenario. And so, you know, we were real concerned 40 years ago about our susceptibility to foreign energy sources. As we move to electrics, we're going to run into a similar kind of problem going forward.
Thank you, John.
And I just, if anybody didn't get their question answered in it, and they're not in a hurry to get an answer, they can certainly feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to address it over the next couple of days.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thanks to all of you for joining us for the North Carolina Economic Forecast. Our next economic forecast and the release of the third quarter report will be in September. So check out our website soon for more information. To help us in planning future events in the Belk College and to get entered to win a Belk College gift pack, please complete our brief online survey by scanning the QR code on your screen. So this concludes our program today, and we will see you in September. Thank you.